Let's get to the big W that we already mentioned, and the I as well,
Sure.
which is an Inquisition. What do we get wrong? What do we get, if anything, right here?
Okay,
Usually.
so let's start Inquisition. And it's interesting that you said big I, because actually in the Middle Ages, Inquisitors first appear in the 1230s. Okay, let's start there. And basically they appear as a last resort because the church has been trying to deal with this massive popular heresy, so-called popular heresy, and heresies in the plural, that are appearing all over, southern France, northern Iberia, northern Italy, and they are very much posing a threat to the authority of the church. They try everything they can think of. They try bishops. They try preaching campaigns by Cistercians. They even try a crusade in Christian territories in the early 13th century, the Albigensian Crusade, and it doesn't work. And people still keep adhering to these non-sanctioned beliefs. And I think very much as a last resort, the Pope creates this office, the office of the Inquisitor. And what it's interesting and it's important to say is that it's not the Inquisition, it's the Inquisitors. So it's not, because when you say Inquisition, you think about this organization with lots of bureaucracy and a very well-structured hierarchy and probably a building somewhere. And
like a KGB of the medieval period.
Yes. Yeah. And in this early period, that's not it at all. What you have is a few guys who are appointed as inquisitors. So, for example, let's say you're in Berlin, right? So let's say that around Berlin, there's suspicion that there's a heretical group and you happen to be a Dominican. And the Pope talks to you and says, hey, you know what? I'm going to appoint you as inquisitor for Berlin. And then you go there and you inquire into the issue. Okay? So that's an inquisitio, because inquisitio means literally an inquirer. And that's what an inquest, if you will. And that's what inquisitors do. They usually work in pairs and they travel wherever there's an issue and suspicion of heresy, and they try to suss out suspects and to interrogate people and to see what's what and to punish those who deserve punishment. And
pretty much like detectives a little bit.
Yeah.
Tiny bit.
And also like public officials in a way. Yeah. They are appointed by the Pope. And what's new about them is that they are invested of papal authority. That means that because in the Middle Ages, jurisdictions were very strict, and you were, if you're in the county of I don't know what, you are under the authority of the count of I don't know what. And if you are under the authority of the King of France, or the different structures of power. But these inquisitors had a special power, so to speak, and they could cross boundaries, jurisdictional boundaries. So because you were a representative of papal power, you could go into the domains of the Count of Toulouse and say, hey, I'm here representing the Pope, and therefore I have authority to do whatever I want in this territory, to judge, whatever I want, to judge heresy. And that brought a lot of issues because, of course, secular powers were all against that. Even bishops at some point, because it's, hey, this is my jurisdiction. What are you doing here? I don't know you. And you come here and say you have the power and you don't. So that's an issue. I mean, it's not like inquisitors were welcomed everywhere and, hey, we're happy you're here, right? The problem is that it's so interesting to see how, for people, the problem were inquisitors. And when I say inquisitors, I say these two guys who came into town, that they thought, well, we killed them and the problem is over, right? Because they travel in a donkey and they have their archives with them in manuscripts in the donkey. So if I burn the archives and kill the inquisitors, the problem is solved. And that happened to the point that the structures of power started thinking, you know what, let's do it differently. And then they started putting inquisitors in convents and safe places. And suddenly it was not the inquisitors traveling to a place where something was happening. But if you learned that something was happening there, you summoned the people from that place to the convent of the Dominican convent of Toulouse, for example. And the inquisitors were kept safe inside. That's part of the thing. That's how it starts. And you had different inquisitors appointed for different regions. That's the thing. And during the Middle Ages, these inquisitors sort of were coordinated in the sense that they mostly used the same procedure. and they used the same way of communicating, and they used the same rules, so to speak, and they did more or less the same things, and they talked among each other. But this was not a formally established, very clear-cut institution with very strict norms. That's something that happened later on, end of the 15th century, when we start talking about Spanish Inquisition, and this one with a capital I, things change dramatically. But during the Middle Ages, we mostly have inquisitors rather than inquisition. And when we say inquisition in the Middle Ages, we are not talking about an institution. We are talking about the process, the inquest, the judicial inquest. That's the inquisitio. That's the first one. Also, let me say this. Although there was torture in some cases, and we have it documented, there are many medieval inquisitors who are very much against torture. And they have this great argument that I think modern politicians in countries I will not name should have in mind when they think about torturing people. And I'm going to quote Bernardi, one of the inquisitors I work with on a daily basis almost. At some point, he says, it makes no sense to torture people, because when you torture someone, they will tell you whatever you want to hear. And this is not why we are here. As inquisitors, we want the truth. And we won't get the truth if you force someone to say something against their will by flogging them or doing all sorts of awful things to them. So this is a 14th century argument that, should be kept in mind. That's about inquisitors. About witches. For starters...
Okay, wait, I just a little bit.
Sure.
So you gave an outline of inquisitors before everything becomes like this massive institution, if it ever becomes the institution. But what about this capital Inquisition with the Spanish Inquisition and Torquemada or whatever? I don't know if I'm saying
that's
that
a famous one, right?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, that's...
just briefly, if you can.
Again, when the Inquisition appears, depends with the capital I. It depends very much on the regions. For example, the one that has the most awful reputation, I would say, is the Spanish Inquisition. But you had Roman Inquisition, which was also terrible. The Inquisition in Venice was also terrible. You have Inquisitions in different places in Europe, and again, depending very much on the region. And these Inquisitions, what they have in common, for example, in the case of the Spanish Inquisition, it's very much related to royal power. So it has a lot to do with Isabel and Fernando, the Catholic monarchs, who have a lot to do with the establishment of the Tribunal of the Holy Inquisition, as it is called in Iberia. Because that's another thing. It shouldn't be called Spanish, probably. It's better to say, Iberian Inquisition, but nevertheless. You have Inquisition in Aragon, you have Inquisition in Castile, and the thing here is depending on who's the subject of the inquest. Because, for example, in the case of the so-called Spanish Inquisition, a huge theme were the conversos. Those were Jews that had been forced to convert to Christianity, but then their conversion was not a truthful conversion, or it was not a very convincing conversion. And then they went back to their ways and went back to being Jews in their daily lives. That was the great target of Spanish Inquisition, because that was a great concern. There was the expulsion of Jews in 1492 from the Iberian Peninsula, from the kingdoms of Isabel and Fernando. And of course, after that, what were known as crypto-Jews were persecuted. That meant conversos, so people who had converted but falsely converted. That was a huge theme for Spanish Inquisition, for example. But some other Inquisitions had other issues. For example, when the Reformation started, the Inquisition of different places have a lot to say about that, obviously. And Protestants, or as they would be soon come to be known, were a huge target too. That's the other thing. But following up on that and linking it to the topic of witches, surprisingly, first I would say that we don't really like to talk about witches, and it's not accurate. We should talk about women accused of witchcraft.
Yeah,
or
that
men
makes more sense.
accused of witchcraft. Basically, because let me say this publicly: witches did not exist. Let me say this loud and clear. which makes it even more jarring, because some of the attempts that have been made lately to reclaim the concept of witch and say, hey, let's move beyond the Middle Ages. Okay, let's go to the trials in Salem, the famous trials in Salem. Yeah. Yes, it's let's save the reputation. You know what? They were good witches. They weren't bad. No, they weren't witches. Period. And why I think it's important to say this, because it's even worse if they weren't anything like that. Because basically what you're saying is that these were innocent women who did nothing wrong. They helped their neighbors. Sometimes they knew stuff about herbs and how to help a woman during childbirth, or how to help cure some illness that the cattle had. And they have this knowledge, and traditional knowledge, passed from mother to daughter over generations, over centuries sometimes. But suddenly, when something went wrong in the community, for example, there was a famine, or there was an illness that could not be explained, some sort of epidemic that, for example, killed children, which was fairly common, you need to blame someone. And they were scapegoats, in the sense that they were like the weakest link of the network. These women usually had little to no family connections. Sometimes they were old women who lived by themselves, and they were easy targets for persecution. So these were women who were accused of witchcraft, and not witches. That's the first thing. So then when we start finding these accusations late second half 15th century, you find these accusations more frequently in valleys, for example, in remote areas. And I have my friend Dr. Pau Castell has worked a lot on the earliest witchcraft trials in Catalonia, for example. But the thing is that something, again, probably unexpected. The best chance for these women was to get to the Inquisition. And now you can be baffled by this. Yeah. Why? Because inquisitors did not believe that women could go through walls or fly at night in broomsticks. So, because inquisitors were, of course, you always, I try to walk on tiptoes here, but they were rational in the sense that they had a very good formation, intellectual education. They were very strong on this. For them, it made no sense that a woman could walk through a crack in the wall, because those powers were reserved for God. No human could do that. And at first, in the early period of the accusations, inquisitors did not believe these accusations. And if a woman could actually travel, escape the jurisdiction, the secular jurisdiction where she was being judged as a witch, and escape and get to a bigger city and appear in front of the inquisitor, most of the time she managed to save herself, basically because the accusations were dismissed. And that's the other interesting thing about witchcraft and how it is so different from heresy, in the sense that heresy is an accusation that comes from above. The Pope, the ecclesiastical hierarchy tries to push this accusation on people and to convince people that, hey, heretics are bad and you should denounce them. But it's the other way around for witches, because the accusation in that case comes from the community, which makes it so awful. It's your own community turning against you for something you have not done, simply because they need to blame someone for some terrible thing that has happened. So that's basically it. And then, of course, it goes crazy. It's why it's called the witch craze in the early modern period, when everything goes haywire and people start being hanged. That was, by the way, the most usual punishment for witches was hanging, not the stake. They were usually hanged and then burned, whereas heretics were burned alive. That's sort of